Imagine you are standing inside a pressurized chamber buried beneath kilometers of ice on Europa. Above you, there is no sky. There is no sunlight. There is only a frozen ceiling stretching upward for roughly 18 miles before it reaches the surface. And that surface is bathed in enough radiation from Jupiter to kill you in a single day. Below you, somewhere in the darkness, an ocean larger than every ocean on Earth combined presses against the underside of the ice. You are protected from the radiation. You are sealed away from the vacuum. And you are trapped. Europa is one of the most scientifically exciting worlds near Jupiter, but tonight, you're going to understand why both ways of living there would be far worse than you think. Before we get started, if you love exploring the depths of space as much as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Also, before we begin, we're now live on Spotify. The link's in the description if you'd like to listen to us wherever you are. Now, are you comfortable? Let's begin. Let's start below the surface. Not because it is the obvious place to begin, but because it is the place most people instinctively imagine when they think about living on Europa. You hear about Jupiter's radiation, you hear about the ice, and the natural response is simple. Go underground, bury yourself beneath the frozen shell, and let the ice protect you. It sounds rational. It sounds like what any sensible engineer would propose. And in a narrow technical sense, it is correct. Ice is an effective radiation shield. A few meters of water ice can dramatically reduce the dose from Jupiter's charged particles. The deeper you go, the safer you are from the radiation pouring down from above. But the moment you commit to that idea, the moment you actually picture what it means to dig a settlement into the ice of Europa, you start running into problems that do not have clean solutions. Problems that multiply as you think harder about them. Problems that transform a reasonable safety strategy into something that starts to feel less like protection and more like entombment. Before we descend into those problems, we need to understand why Europa draws us in the first place. Because the appeal is real. It is not hype. Europa is one of the most scientifically compelling worlds in the entire solar system. And the reason comes down to one thing. Water. Europa is slightly smaller than Earth's moon, with a diameter of roughly 3,120 kilometers. It orbits Jupiter at a distance of about 671,000 kilometers, completing one orbit every 3.5 Earth days. It is tidally locked to Jupiter, meaning one face always points toward the giant planet, just as our moon always shows the same face to Earth. From the outside, Europa looks like a cracked egg. Its surface is among the smoothest in the solar system, covered in water ice that is crosshatched with long, reddish-brown fractures, ridges, and bands. There are very few large impact craters, which tells scientists something important. The surface is young. Something is erasing those craters. Something is resurfacing the moon from below. That something is almost certainly an ocean. Beneath Europa's ice shell, scientists believe there's a global saltwater ocean that may contain more than twice the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. NASA estimates that this ocean could be anywhere from 60 to 150 kilometers deep, wrapped entirely around the moon, between the ice above and a rocky seafloor below. Earth's oceans average about 4 kilometers deep. Europa's ocean, if the models are correct, could average 100 kilometers deep. On a world only about 1/4 the diameter of Earth, that is an extraordinary amount of liquid water. The evidence for this ocean is strong. When the Galileo spacecraft orbited Jupiter between 1995 and 2003, it detected a magnetic signature at Europa that is best explained by a layer of electrically conductive fluid beneath the surface. Salt water conducts electricity. A global ocean of salt water sloshing beneath the ice and interacting with Jupiter's powerful magnetic field would produce exactly the kind of induced magnetic signature that Galileo measured. The surface features reinforce this conclusion. Fractures that look like they were pulled apart by forces from below. Terrain that appears to have been broken up, rotated, and refrozen, as though pieces of ice were floating on something liquid. Ridges that could be the frozen remnants of material that welled up from below. And the ocean is not the whole story. Europa also has tidal heating. Jupiter's enormous gravity, combined with the gravitational pull of the neighboring moons Io and Ganymede, stretches and compresses Europa's interior on every orbit. This tidal flexing generates heat, and that heat is what keeps the ocean liquid despite Europa being roughly 484 million miles from the Sun. The Sun delivers only about 1/27th of the energy at Jupiter's distance that it delivers at Earth. Without tidal heating, Europa's ocean would have frozen solid long ago. So here is what Europa offers. A world with more liquid water than Earth. An ocean that has been liquid for potentially billions of years. A rocky seafloor where water and rock interact, possibly driving chemical reactions similar to those found at hydrothermal vents on Earth's ocean floor. Chemical energy from oxidants that Jupiter's radiation creates on the surface ice. And time, enormous amounts of time, for chemistry to do whatever chemistry does when you give it water, energy, and the right ingredients. This is why astrobiologists are fascinated by Europa. This is why NASA built and launched the Europa Clipper mission in October of 2024, sending it on a 5.5-year journey to perform 49 close flybys of the moon beginning in 2030. This is why the European Space Agency's JUICE mission is heading to the Jupiter system as well. Europa might harbour the conditions for life. Not on the surface, which is a frozen, irradiated wasteland, but in the ocean below. In the dark, under the ice, where liquid water meets rock and energy is available from sources that have nothing to do with sunlight. That is the promise, and it is genuinely extraordinary. Now let's talk about what happens when you try to live inside that promise. The first problem is the ice itself. For decades, scientists debated how thick Europa's ice shell actually is. Estimates ranged wildly, from as thin as a few kilometers to as thick as 30 kilometers or more. The answer matters enormously, not just for science, but for any conceivable human operation. A thin ice shell means the ocean is relatively close to the surface, potentially accessible. A thick ice shell means the ocean is buried beneath a barrier of frozen water, taller than most mountain ranges on Earth. In late 2025, data from NASA's Juno spacecraft provided the first direct measurement capable of distinguishing between these models. Juno's microwave radiometer observed Europa during a close flyby in September of 2022, peering beneath the surface to measure temperatures at various depths. The results, published in the journal Nature Astronomy in December of 2025, were striking. For the case of pure water ice, the data are consistent with a thermally conductive ice shell averaging approximately 29 kilometers thick in the observed region. That is roughly 18 miles of solid ice. If the ice contains dissolved salt, which some models suggest, the estimate drops by about 5 kilometers. If a warmer convective layer exists beneath the rigid outer shell, the total thickness could be even greater. Let that number settle for a moment. 29 kilometers. The deepest borehole ever drilled on Earth is the Kola Super Deep borehole in Russia, which reached about 12 kilometers into the Earth's crust and took roughly 20 years of drilling to complete in rock at room temperature with full industrial support on a planet where everything you need is available. Europa's ice shell, based on the Juno measurement, is more than twice that depth. And you will be drilling not through rock at manageable temperatures, but through ice at roughly minus 160 degrees Celsius, on a world with no atmosphere, no industrial base, no supply chain, and no possibility of outside help. The most commonly discussed approach is not mechanical drilling, but thermal penetration. A cryobot, a probe heated by a nuclear power source that melts its way downward through the ice, letting the water refreeze behind it. This concept has been studied for decades and tested in limited form in glacial ice on Earth. The theory is straightforward. Apply heat, melt ice, sink. Keep going until you reach the ocean. The engineering reality is considerably harder. A cryobot descending through 29 kilometers of Europa's ice would need to operate continuously for months or years, depending on its power output and the thermal properties of the ice. It would need to maintain structural integrity under increasing pressure as it descends. It would need to handle impurities in the ice, salt inclusions, dust, and potentially rocky debris that could block or damage the melting head. It would need to carry its own power source, almost certainly a nuclear reactor or radioisotope generator, powerful enough to melt ice continuously at cryogenic temperatures for the entire descent. And here is the part that matters most for human settlement. The cryobot creates a shaft, a channel of refrozen water behind it as it descends. If you want to send people down, you do not just need a probe, you need a stable, maintained passage through 29 kilometers of ice that remains open and structurally sound long enough to transport humans, equipment, supplies, and habitat modules to whatever depth you have chosen for your settlement. Europa's ice is not static. Tidal flexing from Jupiter deforms the entire shell on every orbit. The ice shifts. It cracks. It moves, maintaining a vertical shaft through a body of ice that is being rhythmically squeezed and stretched by the gravity of the largest planet in the solar system is an engineering challenge that has no precedent and no proven solution. Suppose you solve the access problem. Suppose you get people and equipment down to some depth beneath the surface, perhaps a few kilometers down where the radiation shielding from the ice above is more than adequate. You carve out a pressurized space, you seal it, you establish life support, you have built an underground habitat on Europa. Now you live there. The first thing you notice is the darkness. There is no sunlight. None. At Jupiter's distance from the sun, sunlight is already weak, roughly 50 watts per square meter, compared to about 1,360 at Earth. But even that feeble light does not penetrate kilometers of ice. Your habitat is in permanent, total darkness. Every photon of visible light that exists in your world is generated by your own power systems. The lights run on electricity from your reactor. If the reactor fails, the lights go out. If the lights go out, you're in darkness more complete than any cave on Earth. Because at least caves on Earth are on a planet where the sun is still shining somewhere above you. The cold is relentless. Europa's surface temperature averages around minus 160 degrees Celsius. Deeper in the ice, temperatures rise gradually towards the base of the shell, but the upper kilometers are profoundly cold. Your habitat must be heated continuously, not sometimes, not during sleep cycles, continuously. The ice surrounding your habitat is an infinite heat sink, constantly drawing thermal energy away from your pressurized space. If your heating system fails, the temperature inside the habitat drops toward the ambient ice temperature on a timeline measured in hours. At those temperatures, water freezes, equipment fails, and human life ends quickly. Every joule of warmth in your world is borrowed from a nuclear reactor that you brought with you and that must keep running without interruption for as long as anyone lives there. Power is the foundation of everything, and power on Europa is a problem that has no good alternative solution. Solar energy is essentially useless. The sun is too far away, and the habitat is buried under ice anyway. The only credible power source is nuclear, either fission reactors or radioisotope thermoelectric generators. Fission reactors provide more power but require more maintenance, more shielding, and more expertise to operate. Radioisotope generators are simpler and more reliable but provide far less power, typically hundreds of watts rather than kilowatts or megawatts. A settlement that needs to run life support, heating, lighting, water processing, food production, communications, and manufacturing needs serious power. Multiple kilowatts at minimum, more likely tens or hundreds of kilowatts. That means fission reactors, plural for redundancy. Reactors that must be assembled, tested, and maintained by people who are themselves living in the environment the reactors are designed to support. If the last reactor fails, the settlement dies. Not slowly, not metaphorically. The settlement fails and everyone in it dies of cold, or suffocation, or both, in a matter of hours or days. Communication is another problem that the underground scenario makes significantly worse. Radio signals do not propagate cleanly through kilometers of ice. Ice attenuates radio waves, and the attenuation depends on the frequency, the temperature, the impurity content, and the structure of the ice. To communicate with the surface, with orbiting spacecraft, or with Earth, an underground settlement would need either a physical cable or waveguide running from the habitat to the surface, a series of repeater stations embedded in the ice at intervals, or a maintained open shaft to the surface through which signals could be transmitted. Each of these options requires infrastructure that must survive in ice that is constantly deforming. A cable that stretches across 29 kilometers of ice must tolerate tidal flexing without snapping. Repeater stations must be powered and maintained at intervals through the ice column. An open shaft must resist closure from ice pressure and tidal movement. If communication with the surface is lost, the underground settlement is not just isolated. It is cut off from any possibility of external awareness. No one on the surface, in orbit, or on Earth knows what is happening below. No distress signal can be sent. No guidance can be received. The crew is alone in a way that no human community has ever been alone, sealed in a pressurized chamber beneath kilometers of alien ice, in darkness, in cold, with no way to tell anyone if something goes wrong. And something will go wrong. Over any significant period, machinery fails. Seals degrade, filters clog, pumps wear out, circuit boards corrode. Every component of the habitat has a finite service life, and every failed component must be repaired or replaced using only what the settlement has on hand. There are no supply missions. The nearest spare parts warehouse is on Earth, roughly 500 million miles away. Even at the speed of light, a message to Earth takes roughly 33 to 52 minutes one way, depending on orbital positions. A round-trip conversation takes over an hour, and that is just the communication delay. Actually sending physical supplies from Earth to Europa would take years, even with optimal trajectory and propulsion. This means the settlement must carry everything it will ever need, or it must manufacture replacements from local resources. Local resources on Europa consist primarily of water ice. Water ice can be electrolyzed into hydrogen and oxygen, providing breathable air and potential rocket fuel. But it cannot be turned into circuit boards, medical instruments, reactor components, or the thousands of other specialized items that a functioning habitat requires. Some manufacturing capability could be brought along: three-dimensional printing, basic machining, chemical synthesis. But the range of what can be manufactured in a buried ice habitat with limited raw materials and limited expertise is far narrower than what a full industrial civilization on Earth can produce. The people living in this habitat would need to be extraordinary generalists. Not just scientists, but engineers, physicians, fabricators, electricians, plumbers, farmers, and psychologists. Every critical skill must be represented in the crew, and every critical skill must have redundancy, because if the only person who understands the reactor cooling system has a medical emergency, the reactor cooling system is now everyone's problem, and no one else may know how to fix it. Food production underground requires growing plants under artificial light, in controlled atmosphere, with recycled water and nutrients, at low gravity. Europa's gravity is approximately 0.134 g, about 13% of Earth's. We do not fully understand how plants grow in gravity that low. Research on the International Space Station has demonstrated plant growth in microgravity, and some lunar gravity simulation work has been done, but 0.134 g is lower than the moon's gravity and far lower than Mars. Root development, water transport within plant tissues, nutrient uptake, and gas exchange all depend on gravity to varying degrees. At 13% of Earth's gravity, these processes may behave differently in ways that reduce yields, change growth patterns, or create problems we have not anticipated. The human body itself would be affected. Bone loss, muscle atrophy, cardiovascular deconditioning, fluid redistribution, vision changes. These are documented effects of reduced gravity exposure observed in astronauts on the International Space Station. At 0.134 g, the effects would be less severe than in microgravity but more sustained. People would be living at that gravity level for years, decades, possibly their entire lives. The long-term consequences of permanent low-gravity exposure on human health are genuinely unknown. We have no data because no human has ever lived in sustained low gravity for more than a year or two, and those were in microgravity, not at a fractional g level. The psychological dimension deserves serious weight. You're living in a sealed metal chamber, buried under ice, in permanent darkness, on a moon more than 400 million miles from Earth. The same faces, the same corridors, the same recycled air, the same artificial light, every day, for years. There is no outside. There is no walk in the fresh air. There is no window with a view of anything except ice, if there are windows at all. The psychological research on isolated and confined environments, from Antarctic winter rover crews to submarine deployments to space station missions, consistently documents patterns of cognitive slowing, emotional blunting, interpersonal friction, depression, and anxiety. These effects appear reliably after months of isolation and confinement. On Europa, the isolation would be measured in years, with no possibility of rotation home, no scheduled end date, and no guarantee that the mission will succeed. There is a particular kind of psychological weight that comes from knowing you are trapped. Not confined by choice, in the way an astronaut on the space station is confined, with a return capsule docked and ready. Trapped, in the sense that there is no quick exit. Getting to the surface requires traversing kilometers of ice through whatever access system you have built, a system that might itself be compromised. Getting from the surface to orbit requires a launch vehicle that may or may not be functional. Getting from orbit to Earth requires a spacecraft and a multi-year journey. At every stage, the exit is contingent on systems that might fail. The knowledge that you are multiple layers of functioning machinery away from escape, that every single layer must work, and that failure at any layer means you stay. That knowledge sits in the background of every day. And all of this exists beneath ice that is itself not stable. Europa's tidal flexing produces measurable deformation across the entire moon. The ice cracks, ridges form where ice is compressed, bands form where ice is pulled apart. Chaotic terrain marks regions where the ice has been disrupted from below, broken into blocks, and refrozen in new configurations. A habitat buried within this ice is subject to forces that it cannot control and may not be able to predict. Structural monitoring would need to be continuous. The walls of your world could shift, crack, or compress in response to forces generated by the gravitational relationship between Europa and Jupiter, forces that operate on a schedule set by orbital mechanics, not by human convenience. The Juno data also revealed something important about the shallow subsurface. The microwave radiometer detected evidence of cracks, pores, or other small-scale features extending to depths of hundreds of meters below the surface, with characteristic sizes smaller than a few centimeters in radius. The researchers noted that these features, because of their low volume fraction, shallow depth, and small size, would probably not on their own provide a meaningful route for nutrients to reach the ocean from the surface. This matters for science because it complicates the question of whether surface oxidants can reach the ocean to support potential biology. But it also matters for settlement because it tells us that the near-surface ice is not pristine and homogeneous. It is fractured, porous, and heterogeneous, at least in the upper layers. Building in or through this material means dealing with a structural variability that cannot be fully characterized from orbit. Put all of this together, and the underground scenario begins to look very different from the simple safety calculation that motivates it. Yes, the ice protects you from radiation. That is real and significant. Without that protection, you cannot survive on Europa for more than a day. But the protection comes with a cost that is not measured in REM or sieverts. It is measured in darkness, in cold, in isolation, in machinery dependence, in structural uncertainty, in communication fragility, and in the psychological reality of living beneath the ceiling of ice that is simultaneously your shield and your cage. The underground settlement is not impossible. Nothing about it violates the laws of physics. With sufficient technology, sufficient redundancy, sufficient expertise, and sufficient luck, humans could conceivably survive beneath Europa's ice for extended periods. But the experience of that survival would be unlike anything in human history. It would be more isolated than any Antarctic station, more confined than any submarine, more dependent on machinery than any space station, and more psychologically extreme than any environment we have ever subjected people to voluntarily. And here's the thing that makes the underground option truly difficult to sit with. The ice is not just above you, it is all around you. The ocean that makes Europa scientifically fascinating, the liquid water that drew you across 500 million miles of space, that ocean is somewhere below you, sealed beneath more ice, under pressure, in darkness even deeper than yours. You came to Europa because of the water, and now the water is the thing you cannot reach, the thing that surrounds you but remains inaccessible, the thing that makes your prison scientifically important while doing nothing to make it livable. The underground settlement on Europa is protection that works, but it works by turning the ice into a world with no sky, no sun, no wind, no horizon, no escape. A world where every breath comes from a machine, every degree of warmth comes from a reactor, and every word you send to Earth takes the better part of an hour to arrive. The rational response at this point is to look upward, to wonder whether the surface, hostile as it is, might offer something the underground cannot. Access, visibility, communication. The ability to see Jupiter in the sky and feel that you are on a world rather than buried inside one. The surface of Europa is waiting, and it has its own answer to the question of whether humans can live there. That answer begins with what Jupiter is doing to every square meter of ice above your head, every second of every day. So you go up. You abandon the idea of burying yourself beneath the ice, at least as the only option, and you consider the alternative, a surface settlement, a habitat built on top of Europa's frozen shell, exposed to the sky, with direct access to landing sites, communication equipment, and the operational flexibility that comes from being on a surface, rather than inside it. The case for surface living is real. Underground settlements are protected from irradiation, but they pay for that protection with near total dependence on a fragile vertical link to the surface. Everything that goes in or comes out of an underground habitat, every kilogram of supplies, every piece of replacement equipment, every person must travel through a shaft or tunnel that passes through kilometers of shifting ice. If that link fails, the underground settlement is sealed off. A surface habitat eliminates that vulnerability. You land on the ice. You build on the ice. Your airlock opens onto the surface of Europa. Your communication antennas point directly at the sky. Your power systems, your landing pads, your storage facilities, all of it is accessible without climbing through a frozen tunnel that might collapse. Surface settlements also allow something that underground habitats fundamentally cannot: expansion. On the surface, if you need more space, you build outward. You connect additional modules, you establish secondary sites, you spread across the terrain. Underground, expansion means digging, and every meter of additional space must be carved from ice that pushes back with pressure, cold, and structural unpredictability. On the surface, the constraints are different. You are limited by mass, power, and the materials you brought, but not by the geology itself. And there is something else the surface offers that is difficult to quantify, but important to acknowledge: a horizon. The ability to look out and see terrain stretching to the distance. The ability to look up and see Jupiter, enormous and banded, hanging in the black sky. The human brain was shaped by millions of years of living on open landscapes. Horizons, sky, depth of field, these are not luxuries. They are part of how we orient ourselves psychologically. Underground, There is no horizon. There is no sky. On the surface, there is at least the geometry of an open world, even if that world is frozen and hostile. So the surface has genuine advantages: access, flexibility, communication, expansion, and the basic psychological benefit of openness. If the surface were merely cold and airless, the way the moon is cold and airless, it would still be an extraordinary harsh environment. But it would be a familiar kind of harsh. We have experience with cold, we have experience with vacuum, we have spacesuits and habitats designed for those conditions. But Europa's surface is not merely cold and airless. It has a problem that the moon does not, that Mars does not, that almost no other world we have seriously considered for human presence has to the same degree. Jupiter. Europa orbits deep within Jupiter's magnetosphere, the enormous magnetic field generated by the planet's rapidly rotating metallic hydrogen core. Jupiter's magnetosphere is the largest structure in the solar system. Within it, charged particles, electrons, protons, and heavier ions are trapped and accelerated to enormous energies. These particles spiral along magnetic field lines, creating radiation belts far more intense than Earth's Van Allen belts. Earth has radiation belts too. The Van Allen belts contain trapped charged particles, and they pose a hazard to satellites and astronauts passing through them. But Earth's radiation belts are relatively modest compared to Jupiter's. Jupiter's magnetic field is roughly 20,000 times stronger than Earth's. Its radiation belts contain particles accelerated to energies that dwarf anything in Earth's magnetosphere. And Europa orbits right through one of the most intense regions of this radiation environment. The numbers are difficult to process in human terms, so let's anchor them to something concrete. On Earth, the average person receives a background radiation dose of about 2 to 3 millisieverts per year. That is from natural sources, cosmic rays filtering through the atmosphere, radon gas in the soil, trace radioactive elements in food and water. It is a small dose, and the human body handles it without difficulty. Astronauts on the International Space Station receive roughly 100 to 200 millisieverts per year, which is higher than the ground level dose, but still within the range that the human body can tolerate for limited periods. NASA sets a career radiation limit for astronauts, adjusted by age and sex, but generally in the range of 600 to 1,200 millisieverts over a lifetime. Now consider Europa. Jupiter's radiation belts deliver an estimated 540 rem to Europa's surface per day. 1 rem is equal to 10 millisieverts. So 540 rem per day is 5,400 millisieverts per day. That is roughly 5.4 sieverts every 24 hours. The lethal dose for a human being, the dose that kills 50% of exposed individuals within 30 days without medical treatment, is approximately 4 to 5 sieverts received over a short period. Europa's surface delivers that dose in less than a single day. An unshielded human standing on the surface of Europa would absorb a lethal radiation dose before one full rotation of the moon had passed. Not in weeks, not in days, in hours. This is not cosmic ray radiation of the kind that filters through deep space, the gradual background exposure that Mars settlers or interplanetary travelers would face. This is targeted, intense, magnetospheric radiation. High-energy electrons and ions slamming into the surface continuously, driven by Jupiter's magnetic field. The electrons are particularly dangerous because they penetrate deeper into material than protons of the same energy, reaching through shielding that stops heavier particles. And the radiation is not uniform across Europa's surface. Research published in 2018 mapped the radiation dose distribution across the moon in detail. The harshest radiation is concentrated in broad oval-shaped zones centered on the equatorial regions. These zones, connected at their narrow ends, cover more than half of the moon's surface. Within these zones, the radiation dose is highest, and the depth to which you would need to dig or shield to find protected material is greatest. Closer to the poles, the radiation drops off. The polar regions receive meaningfully less radiation than the equator. But even at the poles, the dose is extreme by human standards. There is no location on Europa's surface where radiation is negligible. There are only locations where it is somewhat less catastrophic. What does this mean for a surface habitat? It means that every structure, every wall, every window, every airlock, every connecting tunnel between modules must incorporate radiation shielding. The shielding must be sufficient to reduce the external dose of 5.4 sieverts per day to something the crew can survive long term. To bring interior dose rates down to levels comparable to what astronauts experience on the International Space Station, roughly 100 to 200 millisieverts per year, you would need shielding that reduces the external radiation by a factor of approximately 10,000 or more. Water is one of the most effective shielding materials for the types of radiation present at Europa. Ice is water, and Europa has plenty of it. In principle, you could mine surface ice and pack it around your habitat modules, building thick walls of ice that absorb incoming radiation before it reaches the crew. A few meters of water ice would provide substantial shielding, but several meters of ice surrounding every module, every corridor, every facility adds enormous mass to the settlement's effective structure. The habitat becomes a fortress of ice, heavy, rigid, and difficult to modify. Every expansion, every new module, every reconfiguration requires mining and placing additional shielding. The simplicity that the surface was supposed to offer begins to erode under the weight of the shielding requirement. Other shielding materials could supplement ice. Polyethylene, which is rich in hydrogen atoms and effective at stopping certain particle types, could be manufactured or brought from Earth. Metals provide some shielding but can produce secondary radiation when high-energy particles strike heavy nuclei, actually making the interior dose worse in some cases. The optimal shielding strategy would likely involve layered materials, hydrogen-rich polymers backed by structural metals, surrounded by mined ice, carefully engineered to minimize both primary and secondary radiation exposure. Even with excellent shielding, the long-term cumulative dose would likely be higher than what astronauts accumulate on the International Space Station. The shielding reduces the dose, it does not eliminate it. Over years of habitation, the crew would accumulate radiation exposure that increases lifetime cancer risk, accelerates certain aging processes, and potentially affects cognitive function. These are not speculative effects. They are documented consequences of chronic radiation exposure, studied extensively in the context of nuclear workers, radiotherapy patients, and astronauts. On Europa's surface, the exposure would be persistent and unavoidable, a background tax on human health that the settlement cannot avoid, only minimize. Now layer the cold on top of the radiation. Europa's average surface temperature is approximately minus 160 degrees Celsius. That is about minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit. At the equator, daytime temperatures might reach as high as minus 143 degrees Celsius. At the poles, temperatures can drop below minus 220 degrees Celsius. These are not winter temperatures in an otherwise moderate climate. These are temperatures at which carbon dioxide would freeze solid, at which most metals become brittle, at which conventional lubricants, seals, and mechanical components behave in ways they were never designed for. Every surface habitat must be heated continuously. The thermal gradient between the interior of a pressurized habitat, maintained at roughly 20 degrees Celsius for human comfort, and the exterior ice surface at minus 160 degrees Celsius is approximately 180 degrees. That gradient drives constant heat loss through every surface of the habitat. Insulation reduces the rate of loss but cannot stop it entirely. The habitat bleeds heat into the ice below it and radiates heat into the vacuum above it. The power required to maintain interior temperature against this relentless thermal drain is significant and continuous. Equipment on the surface faces its own thermal challenges. Mechanical components expand and contract with temperature changes. Seals made of polymers become rigid and brittle at cryogenic temperatures, losing their ability to maintain pressure boundaries. Lubricants thicken or freeze, causing bearings and joints to seize. Electronic components change their operating characteristics as temperatures swing between the heated interior and the frozen exterior. Every piece of equipment that must operate outside the heated habitat, communication antennas, power generation equipment, landing pad infrastructure, surface vehicles, must be designed to function at cryogenic temperatures or must be independently heated, which requires additional power. The thermal cycling itself is destructive. Europa rotates with an orbital period of approximately 3.5 Earth days. The day-night cycle, such as it is at Jupiter's distance from the Sun, produces modest temperature fluctuations on the surface. But the real thermal stress comes from operational cycling. Equipment that is powered up and heated for use, then powered down and allowed to cool, undergoes repeated thermal expansion and contraction. Over months and years, this cycling fatigues materials, loosens fasteners, propagates microcracks, and degrades structural integrity. Maintenance in cryogenic conditions is itself a challenge, because the tools and hands performing the maintenance are also subject to the cold. There's also a problem that sounds mundane until you think about it for more than a few seconds. A heated habitat sitting on ice melts the ice beneath it. Not dramatically, not all at once, but continuously. The thermal energy that keeps the interior livable radiates downward into the surface, and the surface is frozen water. Over weeks and months, the habitat softens the ice underneath its foundation. It sinks. Not fast enough to notice on any given day, but fast enough that over a year or two, the structure has shifted downward into a depression of its own making, with refrozen meltwater creeping up the walls and deforming the surrounding terrain. Managing this requires either insulating the base of the habitat so thoroughly that almost no heat escapes downward, which is difficult across a temperature difference that extreme, or periodically raising and repositioning the structure, which requires exactly the kind of heavy surface operations that radiation constrains. On Earth, heated buildings on permafrost face a version of this problem. They solve it with ventilated foundations and pilings driven into stable ground. On Europa, there is no stable ground. There's only ice all the way down, and it responds to heat the way ice always does. It melts. And all of this occurs in what is effectively a vacuum. Europa has an atmosphere, but calling it an atmosphere is generous. It is a tenuous exosphere of molecular oxygen, produced when Jupiter's radiation breaks apart water ice molecules on the surface. The surface pressure is essentially zero, roughly 1/1,000,000th of Earth's atmospheric pressure. For all practical purposes, the surface of Europa is a vacuum. There is no atmospheric pressure to help contain habitats. There is no convective cooling or heating from air. There is no weather in any meaningful sense, and there is no aerodynamic assistance for landing spacecraft. Every landing on Europa's surface requires propulsive braking from orbital velocity all the way to touchdown, because there is no air to slow you down. Landing on Europa is itself a substantial challenge. The surface is ice, which sounds smooth but is actually highly variable. Galileo images revealed terrain ranging from relatively flat plains to chaotic regions where the ice has been broken and refrozen into jagged, tilted blocks. Ridges tens of meters high cross the surface. Fractures of unknown depth cut through the ice. Finding a safe, flat landing site large enough for a spacecraft carrying habitat modules and heavy equipment requires detailed surface mapping at resolutions that we do not yet have for most of the Moon. Europa Clipper will improve this when it begins its flybys in 2030, but until then, our best images of Europa's surface come from the Galileo mission, which ended in 2003. Low gravity affects surface operations in ways that are distinct from its effects on the human body, which we examined in the context of underground living. On the surface, gravity determines how effectively you can anchor structures, how equipment behaves when it is placed on the ground, how vehicles gain traction, and how debris behaves when disturbed. At 0.134 g, objects weigh only about 13% of what they weigh on Earth. A 100 kilogram module weighs roughly 13 kilograms on Europa. This makes lifting and moving large objects easier in one sense, but it also means that structures are harder to anchor against lateral forces. A habitat module that is not firmly secured to the ice could be shifted by any significant horizontal force, including the force of a pressurized airlock cycling or a crew member pushing against a wall. Vehicles on the surface face traction problems. Wheels or treads rely on the weight of the vehicle pressing them against the surface to generate friction. At 13% gravity, the normal force is much lower, meaning traction is correspondingly reduced. Driving on ice with low traction and low gravity means that stopping distances are longer, turning is less responsive, and the risk of sliding or tipping increases. Surface operations that involve moving heavy equipment, drilling into the ice, or constructing infrastructure all must account for the fact that gravity is working 13% as hard as your engineering instincts expect. And then there is the radiation damage to equipment. This is separate from the radiation threat to human health. Jupiter's magnetospheric particles do not just affect biological tissue. They affect electronics, optical surfaces, solar cells, polymers, and structural materials. High-energy electrons cause displacement damage in semiconductors, degrading the performance of computer chips and sensors over time. They darken optical coatings, reducing the efficiency of cameras, spectrometers, and solar panels. If anyone were inclined to use solar panels at Jupiter's distance, which they would not be. But the principle extends to any optical surface. They cause chemical changes in polymers, breaking molecular chains, making flexible materials brittle, causing seals and insulation to degrade. The Europa Clipper spacecraft was designed to deal with exactly this problem. Its sensitive electronics are housed inside an aluminum and titanium vault, shielded from the worst of Jupiter's radiation. And Europa Clipper is only performing flybys, brief passes through the radiation environment, before retreating to the relative safety of the outer Jovian system. A surface settlement does not retreat. It sits in the radiation continuously. Every external component, every antenna, every solar reflector, every camera, every sensor, every cable, every surface coating is being degraded by radiation every moment of every day. Maintenance and replacement of radiation-damaged components would be a continuous, never-ending requirement. Extravehicular activity, going outside in a spacesuit to perform repairs, inspections, or construction, is one of the most constrained operations on Europa's surface. Every moment outside exposes the crew member to the full surface radiation dose, attenuated only by whatever shielding the suit provides. Spacesuits are not designed to provide the kind of heavy shielding that a permanent habitat can offer. The mass penalty would make the suit unwearable. Typical spacesuit designs for radiation environments offer modest shielding, enough to reduce dose rates by perhaps a factor of 2 or 3, but not enough to make long-duration surface exposure safe. This means extravehicular time must be strictly budgeted. Every hour outside accumulates radiation dose that cannot be recovered. Mission planners would need to calculate how much surface time each crew member can safely accumulate over their posting, tracking individual dose like a consumable resource. Once your allocation is used, you cannot go outside again without exceeding the risk thresholds. This creates a workforce problem. The people who are most experienced at surface operations, who've spent the most time outside, are also the people closest to their radiation limits. Eventually, your most skilled surface operators are the ones who can no longer safely go outside. Repairs that on Earth or even on Mars would be routine become logistical challenges on Europa's surface. Replacing an antenna that has been degraded by radiation means sending a crew member outside in a heavily shielded suit, with a time limit measured in minutes rather than hours, carrying tools that must function at cryogenic temperatures to perform work on equipment that is itself embrittled by cold and damaged by radiation. If the repair takes longer than expected, the crew member must return inside before completing it, and another crew member must go out to finish, consuming another person's radiation budget. Complex repairs might require multiple sorties over multiple days, each one eating into the crew's collective capacity for surface operations. The visual experience of standing on Europa's surface would be unlike anything a human being has ever witnessed. Jupiter dominates the sky. From Europa's surface, the planet appears roughly 24 times the diameter of the full moon as seen from Earth. It hangs there, enormous, banded in swirls of cream and brown and orange, its great red spot visible as a vast storm system larger than Earth itself. The planet does not rise or set in Europa's sky, because Europa is tidally locked. If you are on the sub-Jovian hemisphere, the face that always points toward Jupiter, the planet is always above you, shifting slowly in position as Europa's slight orbital eccentricity and libration cause it to wobble, but never dropping below the horizon. If you are on the anti-Jovian hemisphere, you never see Jupiter at all. The Sun is visible but small. At Jupiter's distance, the Sun appears roughly 1/5 the diameter it appears from Earth. It's bright enough to cast shadows and illuminate the landscape, but it provides little warmth. Sunlight at Europa delivers approximately 50 watts per square meter, compared to roughly 1,360 watts per square meter at Earth's distance. You can see the sun, but you cannot feel it. The sky around it is black because there is no atmosphere to scatter light. Stars are visible even during the day, steady and unblinking in the vacuum. The landscape itself is alien in a way that few environments in the solar system can match. The ice is not white like fresh snow. It is discolored, stained by sulfur compounds and other materials that Jupiter's radiation has chemically altered. The surface has a brownish, reddish tint in many areas, especially along the fractures and ridges where material from below has been exposed and irradiated. The terrain is flat in places, broken in others, with double ridges rising tens of meters above the surrounding plain, and chaotic regions where house-sized blocks of ice have been jumbled and refrozen at odd angles. You stand in this landscape, looking up at Jupiter, knowing that the planet you are staring at is the thing that is killing you. Not its gravity, not its storms, not its size, but its magnetic field. The invisible cage of magnetic force that surrounds it, trapping particles and flinging them at you with energies that your suit can barely attenuate, and your body cannot withstand for long. Jupiter is simultaneously the most visually spectacular thing a human being could ever see in person, and the source of the radiation that makes standing here a calculated act of self-harm. There is something profoundly dissonant about that. Beauty and lethality occupying the same object, the same sky, the same line of sight. The surface of Europa offers everything the underground lacks: openness, access, visibility, communication, operational flexibility, the ability to see the sky and feel that you're on a world rather than inside one. And it offers something else the underground cannot provide: danger that is immediate, measurable, and relentless in a way that makes every moment outside a negotiation between what you need to do and what your body can absorb. The underground traps you in darkness and isolation, but shields you from the worst of Jupiter's radiation. The surface frees you from the ice, but exposes you to a radiation environment that no human being has ever experienced, unshielded, and survived. Both options are real, both are technically achievable, and neither one is safe in any sense of the word that a reasonable person would accept. The question that emerges from this comparison is not which option is better. It is whether the word better even applies. Two versions of survival on Europa exist, and both of them are defined by the thing they cannot solve. Underground, you cannot solve isolation and machinery dependence. On the surface, you cannot solve radiation exposure. The ice is a shield that becomes a prison. The sky is freedom that becomes a threat. And the honest assessment, the one that mission planners and engineers and physicians would eventually write into their reports, is that any human presence on Europa would almost certainly need both. A shielded underground or ice-buried habitat for daily living, sleeping, eating, and long-duration habitation, and surface access for operations, repairs, communication, and the psychological necessity of occasionally existing under an open sky, even if that sky is trying to kill you. That hybrid model, surface and underground combined, is where the real engineering begins, and it is where the full scope of Europa's hostility reveals itself. Because maintaining two environments means maintaining two complete sets of infrastructure, two thermal management systems, two structural integrity regimes, and a transit link between them that must function reliably in an environment that is hostile to everything humans build. That transit link deserves a closer look, because it is the single piece of infrastructure on which both halves of the settlement depend. Whether it takes the form of a vertical shaft with a mechanical elevator, a pressurized tunnel descending at an angle through the ice, or a series of airlock chambers connected by a heated passage, it must do something no structure on Earth has ever been asked to do. It must remain intact, pressurized, and traversable through kilometers of ice that is being deformed by tidal forces on a 3.5-day cycle. Every section of that link experiences stress from the ice pressing inward. Every seal along its length is subject to cryogenic temperatures on the outside and heated, pressurized air on the inside. Every joint must flex enough to tolerate tidal movement without losing integrity. Traversing this link would not be quick. Even with a powered elevator system, moving people and equipment through several kilometers of ice takes time. A round trip might consume hours. In an emergency, those hours matter. A medical crisis underground cannot wait for a 2-hour transit to the surface hospital. A reactor anomaly on the surface cannot wait for a technician to ride an elevator up from below. The settlement would need medical and engineering capability at both ends, which doubles the expertise and equipment requirements for a crew that is already stretched thin. And the link itself must be maintained. Ice builds upon interior surfaces. Seals degrade. Mechanical systems operating in a kilometers-long vertical shaft at cryogenic temperatures require inspection and repair. But inspecting the link means entering it, and repairing it means working inside a narrow passage buried in ice that is itself shifting. If the link fails, the underground crew is severed from the surface. If the underground crew is severed from the surface, every problem we described about underground living returns immediately, and without the option of going up. The surface is not a refuge from the underground. The underground is not a refuge from the surface. They are two different expressions of the same fundamental problem. Europa is a world that does not want you to live there. Not because it is malicious, but because every physical parameter of its environment, the radiation, the cold, the vacuum, the ice, the distance from Earth, the low gravity, converges on the same conclusion. Human survival here is possible only through total, permanent, uninterrupted technological intervention. The moment technology fails, the environment takes over. And the environment is lethal on a timeline measured in hours. That is the surface of Europa, a killing floor illuminated by the light of the largest planet in the solar system. A place where you can see farther and communicate more easily and move more freely than anywhere beneath the ice, and where every second of that freedom costs you something that your biology cannot replenish. The next question is what happens when you stop looking at underground and surface as separate options and start looking at what they share. Because the problems that unite them are, in some ways, more revealing than the problems that distinguish them. Both settlements need air, both need heat, both need food, water, power, medicine, and manufacturing. Both are separated from Earth by distances that make rescue impossible and resupply impractical, and both exist on a world that offers one extraordinary resource, water, while withholding everything else a human body and a human mind require to stay alive. At this point, we have looked at underground living and surface living as separate problems. We examined the ice prison below and the radiation wasteland above. Two different environments, two different primary threats, two different kinds of suffering. And if you were designing a Europa settlement, you might think the challenge is simply choosing between them, picking the option that is less terrible, and committing to it. But that framing misses something important. Because the problems that separate underground living from surface living are not actually the hardest things about Europa. The hardest things about Europa are the problems that both options share. The requirements that exist regardless of where you put your habitat. The survival needs that the ice cannot solve and the surface cannot solve, and that no clever engineering compromise between the two can eliminate. These shared problems are the ones that reveal Europa's true hostility, not as a world with one big obstacle, but as a world where every system a human being depends on must be built from scratch, maintained indefinitely, and operated without interruption in conditions that are hostile to every component, every material, and every biological process involved. Let's start with the most fundamental requirement: air. There is no breathable atmosphere on Europa. The exosphere of molecular oxygen produced by radiolysis of surface ice is so tenuous that it might as well not exist. Surface pressure is essentially zero. A human being exposed to Europa's surface without a pressurized suit would lose consciousness in about 15 seconds and die within minutes. This is true whether you are on the surface or underground. The ice does not contain breathable air. The ocean, if you could reach it, does not contain breathable air. Every molecule of oxygen that a Europa settlement breathes must be produced by the settlement's own systems. The most straightforward approach is electrolysis. Split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen using electricity. Europa has water ice in virtually unlimited quantities, and if you have a nuclear reactor providing power, you have the electricity to run electrolyzers. The oxygen goes into the habitat atmosphere. The hydrogen can be vented, stored as fuel, or used in other chemical processes. But breathable air is not just oxygen. It is a carefully balanced mixture of gases at a specific pressure and temperature, with carbon dioxide continuously removed, humidity controlled, trace contaminants filtered out, and the whole system monitored and adjusted in real time. The International Space Station manages this for a crew of 6 to 7 people using a combination of electrolysis, carbon dioxide scrubbers, and trace contaminant control systems. And it still requires periodic resupply of consumable components. A Europa settlement managing air for a larger crew for years or decades with no resupply must achieve a level of closed-loop air recycling that no human installation has ever demonstrated at that scale and duration. Carbon dioxide removal is particularly critical. Humans exhale carbon dioxide with every breath. In a sealed environment, carbon dioxide levels rise unless actively managed. At concentrations above about 1%, cognitive performance begins to degrade. Above 5%, carbon dioxide becomes directly toxic. The systems that scrub carbon dioxide from habitat air, whether chemical absorbents, membrane separators, or biological systems using plants, all require maintenance, consumables, or energy. Over years, chemical absorbents are used up. Membranes degrade. Plants require their own light, water, and nutrients. None of these systems runs forever without attention, and failure to manage carbon dioxide is one of the fastest pathways from a functioning habitat to a dead one. Water, paradoxically, presents its own challenges despite being the one resource Europa possesses in abundance. The surface ice is not pure. It has been chemically altered by billions of years of Jupiter's radiation, producing peroxides, sulfates, and other compounds that must be removed before the water can be used for drinking, agriculture, or industrial processes. Mining surface ice, melting it, and purifying it requires energy and infrastructure. Accessing subsurface ice or ocean water requires drilling through the shell, which carries all the difficulties we examined when we looked at underground living. Even once you have clean water, keeping it cycling through the settlement systems indefinitely requires a closed-loop approach. Water used for drinking, cooking, and hygiene must be recovered from wastewater, purified, and recirculated. Water vapor exhaled by the crew and transpired by plants must be condensed and recaptured. Water used in industrial processes must be recovered wherever possible. The International Space Station achieves roughly 93% water recovery. For a settlement with no resupply, that number must be higher, and every percentage point closer to 100% requires more sophisticated, more energy-intensive, and more maintenance-demanding equipment. Over years and decades, even small losses accumulate. A system that loses 1% of its water per cycle will eventually run dry, unless new water is continuously brought in from outside. Food production is where the engineering challenge becomes biological, and where Europa's hostility extends into domains that pure engineering cannot fully control. Every calorie consumed by every person in the settlement must be grown on site. There are no food shipments from Earth. There are no greenhouses warmed by the local star. There is no soil ecosystem developed over millions of years to support agriculture. There is only what the settlement builds and maintains. Hydroponic and aeroponic systems, where plants grow in nutrient-rich water or mist, rather than soil, are the most space-efficient approach. These systems have been demonstrated on the International Space Station and in various Earth-based, closed environment experiments. They can produce leafy greens, herbs, and some fruiting crops with reasonable efficiency under artificial light. But feeding an entire settlement requires more than lettuce. It requires calorie-dense staple crops, wheat, rice, potatoes, soybeans, that provide the energy and macronutrients a working population needs. Growing these crops at scale under artificial lighting requires enormous amounts of electrical power, dedicated agricultural space, and careful management of nutrient solutions, pH levels, lighting cycles, and pest or disease control. And all of this must function at 0.134 G. We discussed the effects of low gravity on the human body, but the effects on plant biology are equally uncertain and potentially just as significant. Plants use gravity to orient their roots downward and their stems upward, a process called gravitropism. At 13% of Earth's gravity, this orientation signal is much weaker. Roots may not develop the same architecture. Water and nutrient transport through plant tissues, which relies partly on gravity-driven pressure gradients, may behave differently. Pollination in species that require it depends on the movement of pollen from one flower to another, a process that on Earth is assisted by gravity, wind, and insects. In a sealed habitat at low gravity, pollination must be managed manually or through engineered air circulation. No one has grown staple crops at 0.134 G for extended periods. We have microgravity data from the space station, and we have Earth gravity data from every farm on the planet. But the zone between those two extremes is largely uncharted. A Europa settlement that depends entirely on its own food production is betting its survival on agricultural science that has never been tested under the conditions it will face. Protein sources add another layer of complexity. Plants alone can provide adequate nutrition if the right combination of crops is grown. But dietary variety and nutritional completeness are easier to achieve with some animal protein. Fish in recirculating aquaculture systems, insects raised on organic waste, or lab-cultured cells are the most resource-efficient options. Each requires its own infrastructure, its own inputs, and its own expertise. An aquaculture tank that develops a disease outbreak, an insect colony that crashes, a cell culture that gets contaminated, any of these could eliminate a protein source that the settlement depends on, and replacing it from scratch takes time the settlement may not have. Biosphere 2. The experimental closed ecological system built in Arizona in the early 1990s remains the most ambitious attempt to create a self-sustaining habitat on Earth. 8 people lived inside for 2 years, growing their own food and recycling their air and water through biological systems. The experiment revealed how extraordinarily difficult closed-loop life support actually is in practice. Oxygen levels dropped unexpectedly because soil microbes consumed more oxygen than models predicted. Carbon dioxide fluctuated in ways that were hard to control. Some crop species thrived, while others failed. By the end of the first closure, supplemental oxygen had to be pumped in from outside. Biosphere 2 was on Earth, in Arizona, at sea level, at normal gravity, with full sunlight available, and with the entire industrial and scientific infrastructure of human civilization a short drive away. It still ran into serious problems. A Europa settlement would attempt something far more demanding, in conditions far more extreme, with no possibility of pumping in supplemental anything from outside. The margin for error is effectively zero. Medical care in either settlement scenario, surface or underground, faces a constraint that no amount of preparation can fully overcome. The settlement is its own hospital. Every medical condition that arises must be diagnosed and treated with whatever equipment, supplies, and expertise the crew possesses. On Earth, a patient with a rare cancer is referred to a specialist at a major medical center. A patient with a complex fracture is operated on by an orthopedic surgeon with decades of experience. A patient with an unusual infection is treated with antibiotics sourced from a global pharmaceutical supply chain. None of this exists on Europa. The crew would include physicians, certainly, perhaps a surgeon, perhaps a specialist in emergency medicine or internal medicine. But no crew of any practical size can include specialists in every medical field. A neurological emergency, a complicated obstetric event, a rare autoimmune condition, these are situations that arise in any human population over sufficient time, and they require expertise that may not be present. Telemedicine with Earth is limited by the signal delay. A 33 to 52 minute one-way delay means you cannot have a real-time consultation. You can send images, data, and questions, and wait an hour or more for a response. For a patient in acute crisis, that delay may be the difference between intervention and loss. Pharmaceutical supplies degrade over time. Most medications have shelf lives measured in months or years, not decades. A settlement planning for a multi-year presence must either carry enormous stockpiles of every medication that might be needed, accept that some medications will expire and become unavailable, or develop the capability to synthesize pharmaceuticals on-site from chemical precursors. On-site pharmaceutical production is theoretically possible, but requires specialized equipment, precursor chemicals, and expertise in organic chemistry and pharmacology, adding yet another layer of critical capability that the settlement must maintain. Radiation exposure creates specific medical challenges beyond the general difficulty of isolated medicine. Crew members who spend time on the surface will accumulate radiation dose that increases their lifetime risk of cancer. Managing this risk requires regular monitoring, dose tracking, early detection screening, and the ability to treat radiation-induced conditions if they develop. Chemotherapy, if needed, requires drugs that are themselves toxic and difficult to store long-term. Surgical intervention for solid tumors requires imaging equipment, surgical facilities, and skilled surgeons. The medical infrastructure needed to handle radiation-related health problems is substantial, and the further you get from Earth, the more of that infrastructure you must carry with you. Manufacturing and repair capability determines how long any settlement can survive. Every component of the habitat has a finite operational life. Pumps wear out, seals degrade, filters clog, circuit boards fail. Structural elements fatigue. In a settlement with no resupply, every failed component must be repaired using available materials and tools, or the settlement must be able to fabricate a replacement from raw inputs. Three-dimensional printing and additive manufacturing can produce some replacement parts from feedstock materials. Basic machining equipment can shape metal and plastic components. But the range of parts that can be manufactured on site is limited by the materials available, the precision of the equipment, and the knowledge of the operators. A failed pressure seal might be replaceable with the printed polymer component. A failed microprocessor is not replaceable unless the settlement has semiconductor fabrication capability, which is one of the most complex manufacturing processes in human civilization. A failed reactor component might require metallurgical expertise and materials that the settlement simply does not have. The knowledge required to maintain all of these systems must exist within the crew, not in a database, although databases are valuable, in the minds and practiced hands of people who understand the principles behind the procedures. Information stored on a computer tells you what to do. Knowledge in a trained mind tells you what to do when the situation does not match the manual. On Europa, where conditions are unlike anything the equipment was originally tested in, where low gravity and extreme cold and radiation interact in ways that may produce novel failure modes, procedural knowledge alone is not sufficient. The crew needs people who understand why systems work, not just how to operate them, so that when something unexpected happens, and over years it will happen, someone can reason from first principles and improvise a solution. This is the quiet vulnerability of any long-duration settlement far from Earth. Knowledge is a consumable resource. If the crew's expertise in a critical area is concentrated in one or two individuals, and those individuals become incapacitated, retire, or pass away, the settlement loses capability that cannot be replaced by reading a manual. Training successors requires time, and the successors need aptitude and motivation. Over years and decades, knowledge gaps can develop quietly, invisibly, until the day a system fails and no one present fully understands how to bring it back. Communication with Earth shapes every aspect of the settlement's psychological and operational reality. At Jupiter's distance, the one-way light travel time varies between roughly 33 and 52 minutes, depending on the relative positions of Earth and Jupiter in their orbits. A round-trip exchange takes over an hour at minimum, and can take nearly 2 hours at maximum distance. This is not a conversation. It is correspondence. You send a message and wait. The reply arrives an hour later, responding to a situation that has evolved in the meantime. For routine operations, this delay is manageable. Reports can be sent to Earth, guidance and updates can be received. Scientific data can be transmitted for analysis by teams on Earth with the resources and expertise that the settlement cannot match. But for emergencies, the delay is devastating. A medical crisis, a structural failure, a reactor anomaly. These are situations where decisions must be made in minutes, not hours. The crew must be trained and authorized to make those decisions independently, without waiting for Earth's input. The settlement is operationally autonomous whether it wants to be or not, because the physics of light travel makes real-time mission control impossible. This operational autonomy extends to governance. Who makes decisions? How are disagreements resolved? What happens when the crew's judgment conflicts with instructions from Earth that are already an hour out of date? Over time, the settlement will develop its own culture, its own decision-making norms, its own institutional identity. This is natural and probably necessary, but it also means that the relationship between the settlement and Earth will evolve in ways that neither side can fully predict or control. Planetary protection adds a dimension to Europa operations that does not apply in the same way on the Moon or Mars. Europa is a high-priority astrobiology target. The subsurface ocean may harbor life. If it does, that life would represent the most significant scientific discovery in human history, an independent origin of biology in our own solar system. The presence of humans on Europa, with their cargo of Earth microorganisms, their waste products, their biological emissions, creates a risk of contaminating the very environment they came to study. Planetary protection protocols for robotic missions to Europa are already stringent. Spacecraft are cleaned and sterilized to reduce the bioburden they carry. Components that might contact the surface or subsurface are treated with special care. The goal is to minimize the chance that Earth organisms could survive the journey, survive the surface conditions, and potentially reach the ocean where they might outcompete or be mistaken for native life. A human settlement makes these protocols exponentially harder to maintain. Humans are biological organisms carrying trillions of microbes on their skin, in their digestive tracts, in their respiratory systems. A pressurized habitat leaks, not catastrophically but continuously, tiny losses of atmosphere through seals and joints. Every leak carries microorganisms into the external environment. Every extravehicular activity risks depositing biological material on the ice. Every piece of equipment that contacts the surface and is brought back inside carries potential contamination in both directions. If humans drill into the ice or attempt to access the ocean, the contamination risk becomes acute. A drill path or melt tunnel creates a direct physical connection between the surface environment, which is now contaminated by human presence, and the subsurface, which may be pristine. Preventing Earth organisms from traveling down that pathway requires sterilization measures that may be incompatible with the operational requirements of maintaining the tunnel. The very act of trying to reach the ocean to study it risks destroying the scientific integrity of what you find there. This creates a tension that is unique to Europa among potential human destinations. On the Moon, there is no life to contaminate. On Mars, the contamination concern exists, but is less acute because the surface environment is more hostile to Earth microbes, and the potential biosphere, if it exists, is more uncertain. On Europa, the ocean is the reason you were there, and your presence threatens the thing you came to find. It is worth pausing to place Europa in context within the Jupiter system, because doing so reveals something about the nature of its challenges. Jupiter has 4 large moons, The Galilean satellites, discovered by Galileo Galilei in 1610. In order from closest to farthest from Jupiter, they are Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. Each has distinct characteristics, and the differences between them illuminate why Europa is uniquely difficult. Io, the innermost, is volcanically hyperactive, driven by even more intense tidal heating than Europa experiences. Its surface is constantly resurfaced by lava flows. It orbits deep within Jupiter's radiation belts in a region even more intense than Europa's. No one seriously proposes Io as a settlement target. Ganymede, the largest moon in the solar system, has its own magnetic field, the only moon known to possess one. This magnetosphere provides some protection from Jupiter's radiation, though not complete protection. Ganymede orbits farther from Jupiter than Europa, receiving less radiation. It may also have a subsurface ocean, though thinner and deeper than Europa's. And then there is Callisto, the outermost of the four, orbiting at nearly 1.9 million kilometers from Jupiter. Callisto is geologically dead, its ancient surface saturated with impact craters that have accumulated over billions of years. It has no significant tidal heating. It may have a thin subsurface ocean, but the evidence is far less compelling than for Europa. What Callisto does have is safety. It orbits almost entirely outside Jupiter's radiation belts. Surface radiation levels on Callisto are a small fraction of what Europa receives. A surface habitat on Callisto would not require the extreme radiation shielding that Europa demands. Construction, maintenance, and extravehicular activity would be far less constrained. In 2003, NASA identified Callisto as the most suitable location in the Jupiter system for a human base, precisely because of its low radiation environment and geological stability. Callisto has none of Europa's glamour, no vast ocean, no plumes, no cracks hinting at liquid water just below the surface. It is scientifically interesting, but not scientifically thrilling in the way Europa is. And that is exactly the point. Europa is thrilling because of its ocean, its chemistry, its potential for life, but the characteristics that make it scientifically exciting. Its orbital position close to Jupiter, the tidal heating that keeps its ocean liquid, the radiation that creates oxidants on its surface, are precisely the characteristics that make it hostile to human presence. The science and the danger are inseparable. They come from the same source. Callisto demonstrates that living in the Jupiter system is not inherently impossible. The radiation, the cold, the distance from Earth, these are challenges that a Callisto settlement would face too. But on Callisto, the radiation is manageable, the surface is stable. The engineering challenges, while enormous, are within the range of what we know how to approach. On Europa, the engineering challenges are compounded by an environment that actively resists everything you try to build. This comparison matters because it strips away the temptation to treat Europa's difficulty as generic to outer solar system settlement. It is not. Europa's difficulty is specific. It comes from the combination of extreme radiation, a thick and active ice shell, a subsurface ocean that is simultaneously the primary scientific target and the primary contamination risk, and a geological environment driven by tidal forces that never stop deforming the ground beneath your feet and the ice above your head. Every aspect of life on Europa, whether surface or underground, whether focused on science or survival, is shaped by these combined stresses. You cannot solve the radiation without burying yourself in ice. You cannot escape the ice without exposing yourself to radiation. You cannot access the ocean without risking contamination. You cannot ignore the ocean because the ocean is why you are there. You cannot maintain your systems without surface access. You cannot perform surface operations without absorbing radiation dose. Every solution creates a new problem. Every protection introduces a new vulnerability. And beneath all of this, running quietly through every calculation and every contingency plan is the most fundamental constraint of all. Distance. Europa is not a place you can leave quickly. It is not a place where help can arrive in days or weeks. It is a place where, if your settlement experiences a failure that your crew cannot solve with the tools and knowledge on hand, the outcome is not a rescue mission. It is a loss. The distance to Earth from Jupiter's orbit varies between roughly 590 million and 960 million kilometers. At the speed of current interplanetary spacecraft, the transit time is measured in years, not months. Even with advanced propulsion, the journey takes the better part of a year at minimum. There is no emergency return. There is no fast extraction. The decision to establish a human presence on Europa is a commitment that cannot be undone on any timescale that matters for the kind of emergencies that settlements face. This is not unique to Europa. Mars settlements would face a similar, though less extreme version of the same isolation. But on Mars, solar power works. The atmosphere, thin as it is, provides some radiation shielding and some aerodynamic capability. Surface temperatures, while cold, are within the range that conventional engineering materials can handle. The gravity is nearly 3 times Europa's. The scientific contamination risk is lower. Mars is hard. Europa is harder in nearly every measurable dimension. What emerges from this comparison is not a ranking of which problems are worst, but a recognition that Europa's hostility is systemic. It is not one big problem that clever engineering could solve. It is a web of interlocking problems, each one feeding into the others, each one demanding resources, expertise, and reliability that compete with every other demand. You cannot pour all your engineering effort into radiation shielding because you also need to solve power, food, air, water, medical care, manufacturing, communication, and planetary protection simultaneously. And the resources available for all of these, the mass you can bring, the power you can generate, the expertise your crew carries, are finite and fixed from the moment you arrive. Every settlement plan for Europa is, at its core, an exercise in resource allocation under constraint. How much mass goes to shielding? How much to life support? How much to food production? How much to spare parts? How much to medical equipment? How much to scientific instruments? Because without the science, there is no justification for being there at all. Every kilogram matters. Every watt matters. Every crew member's expertise matters. And there is never enough of any of it. That is the reality of living on Europa. Not one dramatic challenge, but 100 quiet ones. Not one moment of crisis, but a lifetime of maintenance, monitoring, and incremental problem solving in an environment that offers no margin for error and no possibility of outside rescue. The question that remains is why, despite all of this, Europa continues to draw us. Why scientists build missions to study it. Why engineers sketch habitat designs for it. Why the idea of reaching its ocean, of understanding what lies beneath its ice, persists as one of the most compelling goals in planetary science. The answer lies not in what Europa offers for human comfort, because it offers nothing for human comfort. The answer lies in what Europa offers for human understanding. And that answer begins beneath the ice, in the dark, where an ocean has been waiting for billions of years. Everything we have discussed so far has been about survival. How to shield against radiation, how to generate power, how to breathe, eat, drink, stay warm, stay sane, and keep machines running in an environment that offers no assistance and tolerates no failure. These are engineering problems. Enormous engineering problems, unsolved engineering problems, but engineering problems nonetheless. Given enough time, enough funding, enough ingenuity, some version of a human presence on Europa could theoretically be sustained. The physics does not forbid it. The biology does not rule it out. The engineering is brutal but not impossible. But engineering is not why Europa matters. No one is designing missions to Europa because they want to test life support systems in the most hostile possible conditions. No one is dreaming about Europa because they want to drill through 18 miles of ice for the sake of drilling. The reason Europa has drawn the attention of planetary scientists, astrobiologists, mission designers, and the broader public for decades is not about what humans could build there. It is about what might already be there, waiting, in the dark, beneath the ice, the ocean. We have mentioned it throughout this story, referenced it as a backdrop, used it to explain why Europa is scientifically interesting while being operationally hostile. But we have not yet sat with what the ocean actually means. Not as an engineering obstacle or a contamination risk, but as a scientific possibility. Because the ocean is the heart of everything. The reason Europa haunts the imagination in ways that a frozen, irradiated moon of Jupiter has no obvious right to do. Here is what we know and what we do not know, stated as carefully as the evidence allows. We know, with high confidence, that Europa possesses a global ocean of liquid water beneath its ice shell. The evidence from the Galileo mission's magnetometer measurements, from surface geology, from thermal models, and from the Juno microwave radiometer data published in 2025 converges on this conclusion. The ocean is real. It is not a hypothesis waiting for confirmation. It is an observed feature of Europa's interior, inferred from multiple independent lines of evidence. We know, with reasonable confidence, that this ocean is in contact with a rocky seafloor. Europa's internal structure, constrained by gravity measurements and density models, consists of a metallic core, a rocky mantle, the ocean, and the ice shell. The ocean sits between rock below and ice above. This matters enormously because water in contact with rock enables chemistry. On Earth, wherever seawater meets rock at elevated temperatures, chemical reactions occur. Minerals dissolve, new minerals form. Hydrogen is released through a process called serpentinization, where water reacts with iron-rich and magnesium-rich minerals in the rock. These reactions provide chemical energy that can sustain microbial life in complete darkness, thousands of meters below the surface of Earth's oceans, at hydrothermal vents where sunlight has never reached. We know, with reasonable confidence, that tidal heating provides energy to Europa's interior. The tidal flexing driven by Jupiter's gravity and the gravitational interactions with Io and Ganymede generates heat within the moon. This heat is what keeps the ocean liquid. The amount of tidal heating is estimated at roughly a few terawatts, though the exact value is uncertain, and depends on the internal structure and rheology of the ice and rock. If some of this heat is concentrated at the seafloor, it could drive hydrothermal circulation, creating the same kind of chemical gradients that support life at Earth's deep sea vents. We know that Jupiter's radiation creates oxidants on Europa's surface. Energetic particles striking the ice break apart water molecules and other compounds, producing hydrogen peroxide, molecular oxygen, and other reactive species. These oxidants represent a potential source of chemical energy for biology. On Earth, life exploits the chemical gradient between oxidants and reductants, using the energy released when they react. If Europa's surface oxidants could somehow reach the ocean, they could provide a source of metabolic energy for any organisms that might exist there. And this is where the recent science becomes especially relevant. In January of 2026, a team of geophysicists at Washington State University published a study proposing a mechanism by which surface material could reach the ocean. The researchers modeled a process analogous to crustal delamination on Earth, in which dense, salt-rich ice on Europa's surface could become heavy enough to detach from the surrounding ice and sink downward through the shell. Jupiter's radiation alters the chemistry and concentrates salts near the surface. If the resulting ice is sufficiently dense and weakened by impurities, their models showed that patches of this material could break free and descend toward the ocean, carrying whatever chemistry the radiation had produced. Under favorable conditions, the process could begin in as little as 30,000 years on geological timescales, and could repeat over and over, creating a sustained conveyor of surface material into the deep ocean. This is a single study, a numerical model of a proposed mechanism, not a confirmed observation. It has not been validated by direct measurement, but it addresses one of the central puzzles of Europa's habitability: the question of how surface chemistry reaches a sealed ocean in a physically plausible way that can be tested by future missions. At the same time, the Juno ice shell measurement complicated the picture. The 29-kilometer thick conductive ice shell, if accurate and representative, implies a long and difficult path for any material traveling from the surface to the ocean. The shallow cracks and pores detected by the microwave radiometer extend only hundreds of meters deep and are too small and sparse to serve as major transport pathways on their own. The researchers noted explicitly that these features would probably not by themselves provide a route for nutrients to reach the ocean. So the picture that emerges is nuanced. The sinking ice model offers one possible pathway. The Juno data suggests the shallow subsurface is not providing easy shortcuts. The truth may involve both, or neither, or mechanisms we have not yet imagined. This is the honest state of the science. Europa's case for habitability rests on a combination of confirmed observations, strong inferences, and genuinely open questions. The ocean is real. The rock contact is very likely. The tidal heating is real. The surface oxidants are real. But whether these ingredients combine to produce an environment that actually supports biology, whether the chemistry is right, whether the energy gradients are sufficient, whether the ocean's salinity and pH and temperature and pressure are within the range that any form of life can tolerate, these are questions we cannot answer from Earth. They are questions that require going there, looking closely, and measuring directly. That is what Europa Clipper is designed to begin answering. The spacecraft, launched in October of 2024 aboard a Falcon Heavy rocket, is currently en route to Jupiter. It will use a gravity assist from Earth in December of 2026 to pick up speed, and is scheduled to arrive in the Jupiter system in April of 2030. Over the course of its primary mission, it will perform 49 close flybys of Europa, some passing as close as 25 kilometers above the surface. Europa Clipper carries 9 scientific instruments housed in a radiation-shielded vault, an ice-penetrating radar to probe the structure of the ice shell and search for subsurface water pockets, a magnetometer and plasma instrument to characterize the ocean's depth and salinity, an imaging spectrometer to map the surface composition, a thermal imager to detect warm spots that might indicate geological activity or plume vents, a mass spectrometer and dust analyzer to sample any material ejected from the surface or from plumes, cameras to image the surface at resolutions far better than anything Galileo achieved. Europa Clipper is not designed to find life. NASA has been explicit about this. The mission's goal is to assess Europa's habitability, to determine whether the conditions necessary for life exist, not to detect life itself. But the data it collects will transform our understanding of the moon. We will know, for the first time, the detailed structure of the ice shell across much of the surface. We will have constraints on the ocean's thickness and composition. We will know which surface materials are present and where. We will have thermal maps showing where the ice is warmer and where it is colder. And if plumes are erupting from the surface, as some Hubble observations have tentatively suggested, Europa Clipper might fly through them and directly sample ocean-derived material without ever landing. The European Space Agency's JUICE mission, the Jupiter Icy Moons Explorer, is also heading to the Jupiter system, with arrival expected in 2031. JUICE will study Europa during 2 close flybys, but its primary target is Ganymede, where it will enter orbit. The 2 missions are complementary, providing different perspectives on the Jovian system's icy moons and their potential for habitability. These missions represent humanity's next real step toward understanding Europa. Not living on Europa, understanding it. And that distinction matters because the gap between understanding a world and inhabiting it is, in Europa's case, enormous. Understanding Europa means orbiting it, flying past it, scanning its surface and probing its interior with instruments that are designed to survive Jupiter's radiation for the duration of their mission and then be done. Inhabiting Europa means placing human bodies and human lives in an environment that those instruments are engineered to withstand only briefly. Europa Clipper orbits Jupiter, not Europa, precisely because staying in Europa's orbital zone for extended periods would expose the spacecraft to radiation doses that would destroy its electronics. The mission design itself acknowledges what the radiation environment does to anything that stays too long. A human settlement would stay indefinitely. It would not orbit Jupiter on a wide ellipse, dipping in for brief encounters and retreating to safer distances. It would sit on or in Europa's ice, absorbing the radiation, enduring the cold, managing the pressure and the darkness and the isolation continuously for years or decades. The difference between a flyby mission and a permanent settlement is not a difference of degree. It is a difference of kind. And yet the desire to go there, to establish a human presence, to put human eyes and human hands on Europa, persists. It persists because of the ocean. Because the idea that there might be life in that ocean, even microbial life, even the faintest trace of biology operating independently from Earth, is one of the most compelling ideas in all of science. If life arose independently on Europa, in an ocean sealed beneath ice on a moon of Jupiter, it would mean that life is not a fluke of Earth's particular history. It would mean that wherever the conditions are right, wherever water and energy and chemistry converge, life emerges. It would mean the universe is alive in ways we have only speculated about. That possibility is what makes Europa worth the risk. Not for settlement in any conventional sense. Not for colonization. Not for resource extraction or territorial expansion. But for knowledge. For the answer to a question that humanity has been asking in one form or another since we first looked up at the stars and wondered whether we are alone. The irony, and it is a deep and uncomfortable irony, is that pursuing that knowledge through human presence threatens the very thing we are trying to find. Planetary protection is not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It is a scientific necessity. If we humans contaminate Europa's surface with Earth microorganisms, and if those organisms find their way into the ocean through cracks, drill paths, or the sinking ice mechanism that the 2026 study proposed, then any subsequent detection of biology in the ocean becomes ambiguous. Did we find Europan life, or did we find Earth life that we accidentally introduced? The contamination could be irreversible, and the scientific loss would be permanent. This is why the current approach is robotic. Send machines first. Sterilized, carefully controlled machines that can study the surface, probe the ice, and potentially sample ocean-derived material without the biological payload that humans inevitably carry. Let the machines answer the preliminary questions. Is the ocean habitable? Is there chemistry consistent with biological activity? Are there biosignatures in the ice or in ejected plume material? If the answers point toward life, then the question of human presence becomes even more complicated, not less. Because at that point, Europa would not just be a scientific target, it would be a biosphere. And our obligations to a biosphere we did not create would reshape every decision about how we interact with that world. There is a version of this story where humans never set foot on Europa, where robotic missions, increasingly sophisticated, increasingly capable, do all the science that needs doing, where the ocean is studied through ice-penetrating instruments, sampled through autonomous submarines, and characterized by artificial intelligence systems that do not need air or food or warmth or psychological support. In this version, Europa's hostility becomes irrelevant because the explorers are machines that do not suffer, and the machines we could send are not trivial instruments. They are becoming remarkably capable. An autonomous submarine, compact enough to be lowered through a melt shaft by a surface lander, could carry cameras, chemical sensors, sonar, and spectrometers into the ocean itself. It would not need air. It would not need food. It would not care about the darkness or the pressure or the cold. It would operate for months or years on a radioisotope power source, mapping the underside of the ice, sampling the water column, descending toward the seafloor, searching for thermal vents, and transmitting data back up the melt channel to a surface relay. If it broke down, no one would die. If it found nothing, no one would have sacrificed decades of their life for the result. Ice-penetrating radar on an orbiter can map the internal structure of the shell without touching it. Seismometers placed on the surface by robotic landers can listen to the tidal creaking of the ice and infer the thickness and composition of every layer beneath. Mass spectrometers mounted on flyby spacecraft can taste whatever Europa is exhaling: plume material, sputtered surface particles, sublimated ice, and determine whether the chemistry is consistent with biology. None of these instruments requires a pressurized habitat. None of them requires food production or carbon dioxide scrubbing or radiation dose budgets, or psychological support. They do not get lonely. They do not get cancer. They do not grieve for the lives they left behind on Earth. The case for robotic exploration of Europa is not merely practical. It is arguably more scientifically responsible than human exploration, because robots can be sterilized in ways that humans cannot. A machine that has been baked and irradiated to kill every last microorganism can enter Europa's ocean without introducing Earth biology. A human being cannot be sterilized. A human habitat cannot be sealed perfectly. The presence of humans on or in Europa's ice inherently compromises the planetary protection protocols that the science demands. But there is another version. One where humans go anyway. Not because it is easy, not because it is safe, not because it is the most efficient way to do the science, but because there is something about being there. About standing on the ice and knowing what lies beneath you. About looking up at Jupiter and understanding what it is doing to the world you are standing on that no robotic mission can replicate. The human experience of a place, the emotional and intellectual response to standing in an environment that is simultaneously beautiful and lethal, is something that instruments cannot measure and data cannot convey. Whether that experience justifies the cost, the risk, the contamination danger, and the suffering that a human presence on Europa would entail is a question that has no objective answer. It is a question about values, about what kind of species we want to be, about whether the drive to place human consciousness in the most extreme environments the solar system offers is a strength or a recklessness. Reasonable people can disagree, and probably will, for generations. But whatever answer future generations reach, the facts about Europa will not change. The ice will still be roughly 29 kilometers thick, based on the best measurement we have. The ocean will still be sealed beneath it, dark and pressurized and chemically unknown. The radiation will still pour down from Jupiter, day after day, orbit after orbit. The cold will still hold the surface at minus 160 degrees Celsius. The gravity will still be 13% of Earth's. The distance from Earth will still make rescue impossible and resupply impractical. And both ways of living there, underground in protection that becomes imprisonment, or on the surface in freedom that becomes exposure, will still be defined by the same fundamental truth. Europa does not offer a safe place to live. It offers two unsafe places to live. One protected but buried. One accessible but irradiated. And between them, an ice shell that functions simultaneously as the settlement's greatest shield and its greatest barrier, separating the humans above from the ocean below, blocking the radiation from reaching the crew, while also blocking the crew from reaching the thing they came to find. The ice is both the solution and the problem. The radiation is both the threat and, through the oxidants it creates, a potential ingredient for the biology that makes Europa worth studying. The ocean is both the scientific treasure and the engineering impossibility. Everything about Europa exists in this dual state, where every feature that makes it valuable also makes it dangerous, and every protection carries a cost that almost cancels the benefit. Think about what that means for the people who would live there. Every morning, if morning means anything in permanent darkness or under a sky dominated by a gas giant, you wake up in a habitat that is keeping you alive through continuous technological intervention. The air you breathe is manufactured. The warmth you feel is generated by a reactor that must not fail. The food you eat was grown under artificial light, at a gravity your crops were never evolved for. The water you drink was mined from ice that was irradiated for billions of years and purified by systems that must function indefinitely. The walls around you are either ice, protecting you from radiation while sealing you underground, or shielded metal, protecting you from radiation while sitting on a surface where every hour outside shortens your life. You are here because of the ocean. An ocean you cannot see, cannot easily reach, and might contaminate if you try. An ocean that might contain life, or might be a sterile body of salt water in permanent darkness. And you may not know the answer during your lifetime, even though you spent that lifetime a few kilometers away from it. You are closer to a possible second origin of life in the solar system than any human being has ever been. And you are separated from it by a barrier of ice that no technology you possess can breach cleanly. Sit with that for a moment, not as an abstract statement, but as a daily reality. You wake up, and the ocean is there. You eat breakfast, and the ocean is there. You run diagnostics on the water recycler, and the ocean is there. Not visible, not audible, not detectable by any sense your body possesses, but present in every briefing, every research meeting, every conversation about why you are here and what this settlement exists to do. The ocean is the reason for everything, and it is the one thing you cannot touch. Over weeks and months, that proximity without access becomes its own kind of weight. Not a dramatic crisis, not a breakdown, something quieter. A low-frequency tension between purpose and limitation that settles into the background of your thinking and never fully lifts. You are a scientist, or an engineer, or a physician, and you are extraordinarily good at what you do, and you cross the entire breadth of the inner solar system to be here. And the thing you came to study is right there beneath you, and you cannot get to it. The ice is too thick, the drills are too slow, the contamination protocols are too strict, the power budget is too tight. There is always a reason, and the reasons are always valid, and the ocean does not care about any of them. It simply sits there, in the dark, doing whatever it has been doing for 4 billion years, indifferent to the fact that the first human beings ever to come within reach of it are trapped a few kilometers above, arguing about reactor maintenance schedules and carbon dioxide scrubber efficiency. Some people would find meaning in the proximity itself. The knowledge that you are closer to the answer than anyone has ever been, even if you never reach it, might be enough. The data you collect from the surface, the ice cores you pull from the upper shell, the instruments you calibrate and maintain for the robotic probes that might someday descend, all of this contributes. You are part of the chain, even if you are not the final link. Others would find it unbearable. The slow realization that you gave up everything, your home, your family, your world, to live above an ocean you will never see. That the settlement exists because of the ocean, is funded because of the ocean, is justified because of the ocean, and that the ocean might as well be on another planet for all the access you have to it. That gap between purpose and capability, between why you are here and what you can actually do, is a psychological pressure that no amount of training fully prepares you for. Because it never resolves. It just continues, day after day, for as long as you stay. That is the experience of living on Europa. Not just the cold, not just the radiation, not just the isolation or the machinery dependence or the darkness or the low gravity. It is all of those things combined with the knowledge that the reason you are suffering is directly beneath you, sealed away, offering everything you came for and nothing you need to survive. Europa is not horrifying because it is lifeless. A lifeless Europa would be disappointing but simple. You would study it, document it, and move on. Europa is not horrifying because it is boring. It is one of the most geologically active and scientifically rich worlds we have ever discovered. Europa is horrifying because it offers the thing humans want most: water, mystery, the possibility of an ocean where something might be alive, while making both ways of existing there dependent on machines that must never fail, shielding that must never crack, power that must never stop, and discipline that must never waver. The surface can kill you from above. Jupiter's radiation pours down through the vacuum, unimpeded by atmosphere, unattenuated by magnetic shielding, punishing every square centimeter of exposed ice with enough energy to end a human life in hours. The underground can bury you beneath the promise of an ocean. Kilometers of ice above you, an ocean you traveled 500 million miles to study somewhere below you, and nothing in between except darkness, pressure, cold, and the hum of machinery that is the only thing separating you from both. Compare this to almost any other world humans have discussed settling. The moon is airless and cold, but it has no radiation belt bearing down from a giant planet overhead. It is 3 days from Earth. Rescue is difficult, but not impossible. Mars is cold and has a thin atmosphere, but it has roughly 38% of Earth's gravity, a day length almost identical to Earth's, accessible water ice, and a radiation environment that is elevated but not acutely lethal. Mars is hard. Europa is categorically harder. Callisto, in the same Jupiter system, escapes the worst of Jupiter's radiation simply by orbiting farther out. The engineering challenges of Callisto are substantial, but they are recognizable. Europa's challenges are of a different character. They are layered, interlocking, and mutually reinforcing in ways that resist simple solutions. And perhaps that is the most important thing to understand about Europa. It is not a world with a single dramatic obstacle that human ingenuity could overcome with a single dramatic solution. It is a world where every parameter of the environment has been set by orbital mechanics and chemistry and physics to a value that is hostile to human life. Not just one parameter, all of them, simultaneously. And the interactions between those parameters create emergent difficulties that are worse than the sum of the individual problems. Radiation forces you underground. The underground traps you in darkness and isolation. Darkness and isolation require power for light and communication. Power requires nuclear reactors that must be maintained in an environment of cold and low gravity that complicates every maintenance task. Maintenance requires surface access. Surface access exposes you to radiation. Radiation limits your time outside. Limited time outside constrains your ability to maintain, expand, or repair the systems that keep you alive underground. The circle closes. Every exit from one problem leads into the next. This is Europa, a world of circles. A world where the ocean draws you in, and the ice locks you down, where the radiation pushes you below the surface, and the surface is the only place where your settlement can function as something other than a sealed container, where the water is everywhere and none of it is drinkable without processing, where the energy is abundant in the form of tidal heat and radiation chemistry, but none of it is accessible without systems that must themselves be powered and maintained, where the science is compelling and the engineering is punishing, and the two are bound together so tightly that you cannot have one without confronting the other. The missions that are coming, Europa Clipper and Juice will teach us more about this world than we have ever known. They will map the ice. They will sound the ocean. They will taste the chemistry of the surface and possibly of material ejected from below. They will give us the data we need to ask better questions, to refine our models, to narrow the uncertainties that currently span entire orders of magnitude. But they will not make Europa easier to live on. No amount of data changes the radiation flux. No map of the ice changes its thickness. No chemical analysis of the surface changes the temperature. The information will help us understand Europa better. It will not make Europa gentler. And so the story of Europa ends where it began, with a human being standing in a pressurized chamber, surrounded by ice or shielded metal, sustained by machines, breathing manufactured air, eating food grown under artificial light, communicating with Earth through messages that take the better part of an hour to arrive and the better part of an hour to receive a reply. Alone in a way that no human being has ever been alone. Closer to a possible ocean of alien water than anyone has ever been. And separated from it by a wall of ice that is simultaneously the thing keeping them alive and the thing keeping them from the answer they came to find. Europa does not refuse us. It does not reject us. It invites us. It holds up the most tantalizing possibility in planetary science: liquid water, chemical energy, a rocky seafloor, and the time for all of it to matter. And then it sets the price. Radiation that can kill in hours, cold that can kill in minutes, ice that seals the ocean away behind a barrier taller than the tallest mountains on Earth, distance that makes help impossible, and the quiet, constant knowledge that every breath, every heartbeat, every moment of warmth and light and thought is borrowed from a reactor that must keep running in conditions it was never designed to endure forever. That is the truth about Europa. It is not a world that says no. It is a world that says yes, and then shows you the cost. And the cost is everything. Sleep well tonight.